Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Word on the Snakebite. I'm your host Ross Deacon, and in this podcast we talk all about things venomous animal related, from venom research, venomous animal husbandry, animal conservation, herping, and of course snakebite and snakebite initiatives from all around this world. On this episode, I've joining me as my co-host.
Hi, I'm Ed, and before we start I have to do a few formalities. Any views expressed in this episode are the views of the guests and the host, not the facilities or company they work for.
Today we're going to do our first ever episode on snake conservation, and for that we have Save the Snakes joining us and Michael Starkey, who is the founder of Save the Snakes. How you doing, Michael?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So I think we'll get straight onto it, and we'll kind of first talk about how did you actually get into snakes and reptiles, and how did that lead from that to starting the foundation and getting involved in Save the Snakes?
Right. So I think I share a similar beginning to many herpers out there, people that are really enthusiastic about reptiles and especially snakes. But ever since I was a little kid, I was just obsessed with animals. I think I was having my father and mother drag me to the zoo as many times as possible. And I begged them to let me have a pet snake, actually, when I was a child, but they would never let me have one. Up until I was in about, my maybe 9 or 10, and I got my first lizard. And that started a chain of events which would eventually lead me to having a room full of reptiles from around the world. And I think a lot of people that listen to your show might relate to that, how you start with one animal, then very quickly you have a whole room full of them. But yeah, so I started as a hobbyist, actually, and it's really because I didn't have much of a connection from nature. I'm from Sacramento, California in the United States. I grew up in the city. My time spent in nature was very limited. So I didn't really have the experiences of going outside and catching garter snakes or, lizards and things like that. My fascination came from a captive environment. But that really shaped my interest. And also, being a kid of the 90s, I grew up with early internet, started researching species from around the world, found my local herpetological society. And then I just kind of became obsessed with these animals, and especially snakes. I just think they're absolutely incredible animals. But right out of high school, when I was 19 years old, I actually got my first job working with wildlife, and that was studying the giant garter snake. So I was working for a biologist with a species of garter snake, the Amnophis gigas, which is actually the largest in the world. They get about 5 feet long, just over a meter. So for a Thamnophis species, they're quite big, and they're endemic, so they're only found in the Central Valley of California. I did this work for about 4 years, and I was absolutely fascinated with the conservation and studying this really remarkable animal. And I knew that that's what I wanted to do for my life. My captive collection, I quickly found I didn't have the time for it, so I found homes for the animals. And I also really began to appreciate, learning about how some snake species have quite large home ranges. And so it began to also make me think a little differently about, keeping snakes in enclosures a little bit. But I still have some snakes today.
That's one of my things as well, is the native ranges of some of these animals, and that would kind of limits what I keep quite considerably, actually. There's a lot of species I'd love to keep, but I just can't get my head around the space that I can offer them against the space that in the wild that they would use.
Exactly. And I think it's just important as a hobbyist to really to think about it and trying to provide those natural conditions as much as possible. I'll be pretty blunt. I don't buy the argument that snakes sit curled up all day. I've studied species and they do move quite a bit. So I think it's important to provide that as much as possible. But basically, go ahead, please.
I feel like pretty much the same. I have a size limit on snake that I will keep, so that I know that when the snake's fully stretched out, even at that point, it still isn't the length of the enclosure. It's still got about half its body length again. And I kind of try to do things a little bit differently personally, I try to keep to a usable space ratio rather than the size of the enclosure. So I think too many people will have a big reticulated python, for instance, and then they will have it in what is deemed to be a big enclosure for a retic. However, if you look at the usable space, they actually take up 45 to 50% of the usable space in the enclosure. Whereas if you keep a colubrid, people keep them in a lot smaller enclosures. However, they're still not giving them enough usable space. So they're still, even though the animal's smaller, they're still giving them a relatively small enclosure to the size of animal. So I tend to keep off a ratio of around about 15 to 20% of the animal's volume takes up the volume of the enclosure. And it's a little bit different way of thinking about it, but for me, it seems to work quite well.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting you bring that up. And that might be a big difference, or at least something that I've noticed from like European and UK keepers to, in the United States, a little bit of a different kind of mentality about keeping these animals. And I've always been incredibly impressed with some of the keepers, in the UK and Europe, where they have these enclosures where you actually get to see some really interesting behaviors. And you have these different basking sites, and you actually get to see quite a bit of natural behavior from species just because of that difference in philosophy about keeping them.
Well, that's one thing that I try and keep species with that show or demonstrate some form of social behavior as well. So one of my favorite species is I keep Malpolon, and I keep pairs together, and it's actually really interesting seeing the interactions between them. We have to give them the space and the conditions to show those interactions and to show some of the natural behaviors. Like the male will, when you feed them, the male will take the mouse and he'll take it over to the female and guard the female while she eats and stuff like that. But when I first got them, I was keeping them in a smaller enclosure, and I wasn't particularly seeing that. I was seeing more. He was more driven to kind of by the food, and then as soon as I gave them more space, I realised he patrolled the enclosure a lot more while she was basking. Then she would disappear off, and then he would bask while over the entrance to the kind of the crevice cave that I've got for them. It's just all these natural behaviours I think that you see, and kind of giving them the extra space and, as you say, the facilities to do so. It's amazing what you can actually see and witness yourself.
Definitely. So I just to kind of get back to the topic of like, my I guess herpetoculture upbringing. Definitely, it was my interaction with keepers and hobbyists that really inspired me to kind of want to see these animals in the wild. And so in my early 20s, I did quite a bit of traveling. Most of it was professional, actually. Because I didn't really have a lot of money available, so I would try and find working opportunities abroad or volunteer opportunities where I could kind of get like rent and food covered and work on a project. Just an example. I worked for the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute for a postdoctorate student, a doctorate student studying frogs in Panama. And so, cool. Yeah, so these, when I think it's really tough for young people that maybe are keeping snakes or they're interested in snakes and other reptiles, and they think, oh, I want to work with these animals. And I know when I was a kid, if I wanted to work with animals, it was really limited to like, okay, you could be a vet or a zookeeper. And I think that field of working with reptiles has changed so much. And so I would find many opportunities as I could to travel and work with these animals or something like that. But that experience in Panama really changed me. And so it actually kind of spurned a love of Latin America and working and traveling in the country. But snakes have kind of been this underlying passion, but it doesn't always work out that way. You don't always get to work with what you love. And so I had to work with the diversity of wildlife and for the California Department of Fish and Game, now Fish and Wildlife, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. So from doing salmon surveys in California, migratory bird surveys, even, just doing general reptile amphibian surveys, I had to kind of have many different working jobs, just to pay for the love. And so it wasn't until I was much older that I was able to kind of take all this experience and then turn it into this nonprofit, Save the Snakes. Because later on in my 20s, I started, seeing conservation and learning more about wildlife conservation efforts. And I started seeing all the work that was being done for elephants and tigers. But, what about, gharials or, island iguana species or, king cobras, critically endangered species, threatened species. There's a few projects working towards them, but it's nothing in comparison to what's happening with some of these other animals. And so kind of came up with this idea, and it took a long time for it to come to fruition. So the idea of Save the Snakes kind of came back in 2013 when I was just working as a biologist for actually a company, so doing consulting biology, and just learning about San Francisco garter snakes. So working in the Bay Area and thinking about all the protections that were imposed by the government to protect this snake, but then trying to think about other ways that can get people to really actually be proud of their snake. So San Francisco actually, some people might know that there's an endangered species of Thamnophis there, but most don't really know that. And so it's just trying to think about ways to get snakes to be looked at like these other really amazing wildlife species. And so this idea of Save the Snakes came about. But it wasn't until 2017 when we partnered with an organization in India to pilot Save the Snakes. And so we piloted with the Eastern Ghats Wildlife Society in South India to basically create a funding model so that we could support their in situ conservation work, right? Because the idea is that people on the ground that are working with these animals, they may not have time to write grants. They may not have time to develop a social media presence and market their work so that they get donations. But in the United States, we could actually do that. There's basically, by establishing a nonprofit organization, you're able to do this, and you can support these projects internationally. And so when we started that work, we saw that this one program in South India actually really grew. They were able to get support from other organizations, zoological organizations. They were making more connections. And so Save the Snakes was able to highlight this work, and so that they were able to get other opportunities. And so that's sort of where we're at today, is where we've created this organization that can support projects that are really in their infancy and need like a little bit of seed funding to get started. But then once they get that awareness to their projects, they get a little bit up and running, they also get the kind of the validation from a United States nonprofit. I hate to say, like, it sounds so arrogant, but it's kind of it's unfortunately the way this conservation world is. When you have a nonprofit in the United States supporting a project abroad, it shows a lot of support and it shows recognition, and those projects are able to thrive better than without that support. And so we use that to our advantage, right? We try not to make it that it's like, oh, we're a U.S. nonprofit. It's like, no, because it's not about us. But anything we can do to support those projects, to make it so it's easier for them to get funding, that's what we're all about. And so that's a little bit of like the nuts and bolts of Save the Snakes. But I'd like to take an opportunity just to speak about what we're focusing on and how we do it.
Please do.
So Save the Snakes is dedicated exclusively to snake conservation and human-snake conflict mitigation. And when we started Save the Snakes with that one project in India, they had already, incredible work that was being done with other wildlife species, but they wanted to jumpstart this snake project. And from my ignorant way of thinking, I was like, oh yeah, we're just going to go in there and we're going to, get money to these people, and they're going to save king cobras, and it's going to be this wonderful thing. And it's like, no, the people hate king cobras that live there. It's like, why would they ever want to save these animals? Because snakes bite people, and so people are terrified of them. There's these, myths and superstitions about them. And generally, they're just very feared. And so we had to combine this idea, because if we're going to save snakes and, bolster threatened populations, we have to work with communities. We have to change perceptions of snakes, and we have to solve the human-snake conflicts that exist in these places where people have a conflict with snakes. And so basically our way of doing that is we use community outreach and education to kind of create a harmonious relationship between humans and snakes. And the long-term goal to save the snakes is that we can outline areas that are strictly for wildlife, because we believe strongly that for wildlife to survive, you need to have habitat preservation, because humans and wildlife, we can't always coexist. Wildlife need their own places to really thrive and have those natural ecosystems that are not necessarily being interrupted by humans. But there is a little bit of an area between those wild places and those buffer communities that live on the outskirts of wildlife reserves where we see that great conflict happening. And so those are the communities we want to reach. And these are generally poor areas of the world, very rural, that may not have access to certain things that people in the West might take for granted, like internet to identify species, or, simply things like, having appropriate footwear from their places where they work. So they might actually step on a snake, or they may not see a snake if they're walking home at night and they don't have a light. So looking at all these little things, you start solving these little situations that are creating conflicts, just with simple changes to daily routines, or changes to way people manage their land, and you start to see conflicts with snakes greatly decrease, and thus snake bites decrease. Have you spent much time talking about snakebite at all on your show?
Every episode before this.
Yeah, so
our 11 episodes before this cover bar one, cover snakebite in different countries. We've spoken about snakebite in India. Indonesia was our latest. Right. Lots of different African countries. We've even spoke about different rear fang snake bites from rear fang species, or Glyphus species and such. So that's our main thing. That's our main focus as a podcast, which is obviously about venomous reptiles. But
I should reframe the question. I'm sure you've talked in great detail about the very exciting, but the recent declaration of snakebite as a neglected tropical disease. So your viewers are probably very familiar with that.
So we have an episode coming up on it actually, where we have Dr. David Williams coming on to the show to talk about it. So
that's okay.
We have shared a lot of stuff on our Facebook page, on our Instagram and stuff around it, but we've just not had chance to get David Williams onto the show to actually talk about it properly. And I think it's not next week we're recording; it's the week after. So,
well, he will provide so much more information about it, and that's actually really exciting. You're going to have him on. But very quickly, the connection between Save the Snakes and the global snakebite epidemic are very closely linked. Because when the World Health Organization declared snakebite a neglected tropical disease, that's when Save the Snakes rushed to get our nonprofit status. Because we knew that when snakes were going to be kind of put on this, I don't want to say put them on a pedestal, but that's anyway, they're basically going to be put in the spotlight. And much of the attention is going to be negative, right? It's snakes are biting people. People are dying. I'll let David speak on this much more, but the numbers are absolutely insane with the amount of people that are dying. Between 80 to 140,000 people a year die from snakebite, and most of these deaths are occurring in places of the world that don't have proper access to effective, snakebite treatment, or access to getting to the hospital might be delayed by, hundreds of kilometers of travel, or whatever, distrust in Western medicine. The reality is there's this epidemic. And so when the World Health Organization made this declaration, we rushed to get our nonprofit status because we wanted to create a voice. Because while we work with communities to mitigate human-snake conflict, our clients are kind of the snakes. We're out there advocating for snake conservation because we want people to respect snakes, their right to live in nature, and to have an understanding that snakes are actually a critical animal for our ecosystems, right? So they provide humans an ecological service by being a natural form of pest control. Their venoms are so useful, and obviously, the treatment of snake bite and anti venom, but also in many other, heart treatments and even breast cancer. So we're learning new things about venom, and then snakes just in general in the ecosystem. Being predators and prey for many different species, snakes are just an essential part of the food web. And so we wanted to make sure that that part of the story of snakes and its connection to humans and the snake bite, that their importance really didn't get missed. Um, because just as how there are conflicts, human wildlife conflicts with elephants and tigers, like wolves in the United States, there are many groups that are working on that conflict directly, with the farmers and ranchers or community members. But there's also many advocacy organizations for those animals. But the thing is, wolves, tigers, and elephants are all cute and cuddly, right? You could easily find a cute stuffed animal, or people just like them for their intrinsic value, their beauty. Snakes don't have that. They don't have that charisma. We might be obsessed with them because, we're those weird snake people, right? But to most people around the world, snakes do not have that, that appeal. And so we wanted to paint snakes in a different way. We're not trying to get people to love snakes, but we want people to respect their right to exist without harm, and to understand that there are solutions for people that do live with snakes, and there are ways to mitigate that conflict. And so that's kind of a snapshot of what Save the Snakes is doing. But, by kind of empowering communities to solve human snake conflict themselves, so finding individuals in communities where there are a high prevalence of snake bites or venomous snakes, but finding those people that can directly mitigate that conflict, we've been seeing great success in actually the reduction of people killing snakes, because they feel like they have someone they can go to kind of help solve their problem. And we believe that that is a long-term strategy for actually preventing snake bite, but also increasing the populations of some threatened snake species.
That was something that one of our previous guests has said. In India, it's he felt like a lot of it is changing the way that people are thinking about the snakes. It is helping them with their snakebite situation as well. So as you say, they couple hand in hand with each other, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to talk about conservation on the podcast, because we can show people that it's got benefits in more than one way. Conservation has got benefits from, as you say, from the snake bite, because of the education that you're giving to people, and it makes a big difference.
Definitely. Yeah, and also trying to, I don't know, just an example, in the United States and in Northern California, we're seeing, I think this is actually might be around the entire country, but a incredible rise for people that are looking to remove venomous snakes or snakes in general off their properties, but they don't want to kill them. And so seems to be, from our, kind of anecdotally, like in the United States, we're seeing that there's a rise in sort of like humane relocation versus just grab the shovel. Which it's hard to say how this has happened. I like to actually think that they're through, TV and the popularization of reptiles through some of these TV shows that has actually probably helped quite a bit. Love him or hate him, Steve Irwin did have a huge impact on the way that people feel about snakes. And I actually like to think that as an organization, as a nonprofit, I think that we have more people in the United States that contribute to our work because of that kind of mass, exposure to reptiles and amphibians in general. And that has actually allowed people to, let snakes crawl into their heart, and people kind of actually have a little bit of empathy or compassion for these animals,
And I think that's something, if you're on some of these snake ID sites, is something that we are seeing less and less and less of. As people are understanding the species and the snakes that live around them, we're seeing less of people taking photos of dead animals where they've smashed its head in with a shovel.
True.
And we're seeing more of people taking photos from afar, asking if asking what the species is so that they can keep their cats, dogs, children themselves away from the species instead.
Mm-hmm.
But then we do still see masses of videos of people picking up coral snakes, for instance. There's a big one in the US that I've seen quite a few times in the last 12 months. And we still get that wherever you are. And I think that's something that I don't think will ever change. It's a ignorance of human thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
And one downside to snakes is that snakes are small generally, right? And so it allows humans to sometimes feel the confidence to kind of pick them up, and so there is a lot of ignorance. There's a joke in the United States about snakebite victims. They're kind of statistically men, and they've usually ingested alcohol before picking up a snake. And so the joke is, right, most snake bites begin with "hold my beer." So
doesn't surprise me.
yeah. So anyway, but we see that a lot. But it's the people that we're hoping to reach are the people that might accidentally get bitten by snakes, because that is by far the greatest number that are being bitten. And a lot of these are people that live in very rural areas and don't, again, necessarily have access to, the proper medicine when a snake bite should occur. And so that's sort of how we're trying to reach those people. It's ignorance is everywhere, but a little education goes a long way. And so we're very, very happy because the partners that we work with are incredibly impactful, and we're seeing some behavior changes in relation to snakes, and people are starting to greatly think about their place in the environment that they live, so they're more aware if they would see a venomous snake, and then they know what to do about it in that situation.
And that's a great thing. That is definitely a great thing, and I think it's something that, as you say, people are seeing more and more and more of. We're seeing more and more and more of in a lot of countries, not just the Western world. And I think as the Western world becomes more accustomed to it, I think that seems to drag. Well, that feels like it does follow East. Sometimes the East can follow the West with these type of things as well.
Yeah.
So moving the conversation on slightly to more of kind of the work that you're doing and kind of the areas that you are currently working in, because I think if memory serves me right, you do have projects on some very interesting species ongoing as well, which I think our listeners would really like to hear about.
Yeah, definitely. And so Save the Snakes works in kind of a way that may not be, if people are not familiar with your organization, we don't rarely talk about the structure, right, of how Save the Snakes operates. Let me first say that. So Save the Snakes is a U.S.-based organization. Our board members basically steer the decision of the organization and make the decisions for what we choose to support, how we operate. But it's our scientific advisory committee that greatly impact how we support our programs. And so we're very, very fortunate to have 17 snake conservationists and researchers, toxinologists from 10 different countries that support our work. And so this combination of the scientific input and then with the direction of the board of directors, we're able to work with some incredible partners around the world. And so what we do is we identify individuals or small organizations working on a snake issue or a human-snake conflict issue, and then we work with them to support their work, right? And so it started with this project in South India, the Eastern Ghats Wildlife Society, which is a wildlife NGO in India. And they were working to protect king cobra populations through human-snake conflict mitigation strategies, right? So some of the things I talked about, holding large educational events for the community, schools, workers and at rice mills or in different areas, basically, so that if they see a snake, they're able to have a little bit more information. But importantly, though, is that they're also training snake rescuers, so they identify people in the community that can actually be someone that can rescue a snake if needed. There's one individual in South India, for example. He rescues about 10 snakes a week. And before members of the Eastern Ghats Wildlife Society got to him, he was just using like a long bamboo twig to rescue cobras and Russell's vipers. And so they were able to get him some, snake tongs and some hooks and give him a little bit more training so that he is actually much more better prepared and safe in the way that he handles these snakes.
That sounds very, very familiar from other guests we've had. They've always spoken about the local snake catchers, the lack of tools, the lack of knowledge of using tools, and almost, and I think Dr. Mahar was saying that it's actually sometimes actually a fear of using tools because they think that it was hard. She explained it a different way, but kind of they're scared to use tools because it thinks that it's going to change the way that the animal reacts or whatever. But they don't necessarily think of it from a safety point of view. Their way of thinking is different to ours.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing how often that message comes across with the different people that we've had on the podcast, actually.
And just learning new technology is always, very difficult. So, yeah, but that's just one example of a project that is kind of our long-term support. So we're working with them to really, see that their conservation goals are protected. And then in the period of the last few years that we've been supporting them and, highlighting their work, they've actually had great success, and they've rescued a few king cobras now. Because before, what was happening is they would hear about a king cobra that was killed, and then they would go out and interview the people who were, in that situation. And now, directly as a result of their programs, people are calling them, and they're able to rescue, a king cobra before it actually, gets killed. And so it's very exciting to see the success of their programs, and we're very happy to support them in the way that we can. Another program that we're working with, though, is in Kenya. Excuse me, I don't want to get to Kenya yet. Is in Nepal. Sorry. And we're supporting an individual named Kamal Devkota. And what he is doing is he's basically creating snake education centers throughout Western Nepal to, mitigate human-snake conflict. And, for some of your viewers that may not be familiar with Nepal, it's not just the Himalayas. We have to tell people quite often, like, okay, Nepal is not just a giant mountain, even though that's why most of the people, go there to go climbing and, see kind of more mountainous kind of stuff. But there's actually quite a bit of lowlands and agriculture and kind of rural areas in Western Nepal. And so throughout this district in Rubundi, Kamal has been going and establishing these centers. And so he's actually working on creating video and educational materials that can just be distributed in Nepali so that people in these communities have the resources to mitigate human-snake conflict. When we were there actually last, I think November in 2018, and we visited a hospital that has basically, this particular hospital is a key resource for people within about an 80-kilometer radius. And through the education work of Kamal and his organization, they've seen that more people go to the hospital versus going to a traditional healer. And so we've actually seen more snake bite cases be actually solved, and people had their lives saved because of these education efforts. But then I want to jump into some of the kind of smaller projects that we're supporting. Because when we started this project, when we started supporting this project in India, which was the founding project of Save the Snakes, we very quickly got calls from around the world where people were looking for support. From Mexico to Bangladesh to Ghana, people all over were wanting to, create a project or look for support or funding for their project to, usually a human snake conflict project. And so we saw that there was really a tremendous need to mitigate human snake conflict around the world. And this kind of, again, plays back to the World Health Organization declaration of snakebite being a neglected tropical disease. It truly is a worldwide issue. And so we saw that so many people were looking for support. We decided to start a small grant program called the Save the Snakes Support Grant, where we would usually award between $500 and $1,000 to kind of jumpstart a project or to, pay for, basically just some expenses to get the project moving. And these can be in different ways. And so our first grant run in 2018 had 15 proposals from 9 countries, which we were actually really surprised that we had that many, and especially from that many countries. And we were able to support 2. And I mentioned Kenya earlier. In Kenya, we supported an individual named Patrick Kenyatta Malonza to reduce human-snake conflict in his area of Kenya. And he's produced some incredible educational materials that have been distributed throughout the Mwingi area of Kenya. And it's been really interesting to see his work kind of grow. But Save the Snakes was able just to support the creation of these materials and a few workshops that were able to educate. We haven't gotten the final numbers yet, but hundreds of people in this area. And then a similar project was happening in Zambia, right on the border of some very large wildlife refuges, where there was kind of this community and a lot of tourism there. And we supported a gentleman named Ken Waterhouse with his organization to basically, again, just educate as many people about snakes, but also to train snake rescuers. And so Save the Snakes was able to support a few snake rescuer workshops where we were able to, Ken and his team were able to buy, again, tools like hooks and tongs and distribute them among snake rescuers to better mitigate human-snake conflict. I'm not sure if either of you work with mambas. Do any of you work with black mambas?
Yeah, I work with all 4 species of mambas.
Yeah. So, man, I just work with like little rattlesnakes. That's like my expertise, working with Northern Pacific rattlesnakes. And I'll watch these people work with these mambas, and I'm like, this is so insane. So I have great respect for people that work with this species, and Ken and his team, they do it like it's nothing. And anyway, so we're really happy to support those projects because it's really impactful that they're able to use such a small amount of money, but it goes a long way. But then the last project I just want to talk about is in Colombia. And this is actually kind of an interesting project because it's not really dealing so much with human-snake conflict, but it's working with a species of Bartol's forest racer, which is a really poorly known snake. It was only known from 2 localities in Colombia, and it was thought to be extinct. I think it was declared extinct 70 years ago. And we supported a biologist named Julian Rojas Morales to actually work with a community to protect this snake. And so he rediscovered this critically endangered, racer, it's basically like a colubrid, like a whip snake. And probably some of your viewers are much more knowledgeable about South American colubrids than I am. But just a very fast-moving diurnal species of snake. Really little is known about it. And so he's working to study the species, but it was critical that he worked with the community where this snake was found, because if they ever saw a snake, it would be terrible if they killed it, And so he's been working with them to identify the species, explain why it's important, it's critically endangered. That way it's just, kind of puts the brake on the pressures that this snake is facing, so that, more conservation efforts can be, put in place to make sure that it exists in eternity. And so we're really excited for this project because it is really at the core a snake conservation project, and we're excited to see sort of the long-term impacts from Julian's work.
That sounds pretty amazing. So as you say, you're very, very global as an organisation. You're involved in a lot of different things, which is great to hear. It's as you say, the rediscovery of a snake that was thought to be extinct 70 years ago is pretty special in itself. Really, it's that's definitely something that maybe a later episode, once more is known and more is done, we can have another conversation on that species alone, probably, and I think that'd be quite interesting. It's something you've said that I find quite interesting is that you've helped produce a lot of different learning materials and awareness materials for local people and such forth like that. we would love it if we could get hold of some of that, so that we can share it on our page, so our listeners can see the kind of things that the people that you're helping are working on, and are developing and are producing to help with this snake human conflict that's going on. Because I think that's one of the biggest things that we had from an episode a couple of weeks ago, where they're working they're on about India is working on a snake bite based app for your mobile phone, because everybody in India is becoming more and more connected to the world, and they're getting a lot more people are getting smartphones, and they're developing very fast as a country. So they're targeting using not necessarily using social media, but using social apps, and targeting this massive growth of media and of smartphones and connectivity in the country to drive help with when somebody has been bitten and such forth, and all these things and we've shared little bits and pieces on that. We've shared a few videos from a few of the people who have worked on there, that they're to teach kids, and songs that they use in their countries to teach kids about snake bites, which snakes that they shouldn't be touching, and stuff like that. So all that type of information, I think we would love it as a definitely as an admin team to be able to get that out to our listenership, and if that helps one other person come up with something that can help them in their country, it's worth it. I believe that it's definitely worth it, worth sharing it at that point.
Definitely, and I agree so much with that. And so currently, again, there's always so much to do. But so one thing that actually is a way that some of your listeners could support Save the Snakes, we are desperate for translators. And so we created like a very, very simple infographic with just some general things about to avoid snakebite. And so far we've translated, I think, into 5 languages, with I think 2 more that are I'm waiting to do some reviews on. But just that's kind of the thing, is like, where do people find this information? And so, we're using, search engine optimization techniques and, different ways to broadcast this information online to basically get people to come to our website to see these resources that are available. And we're in the process of creating a hub for all these resources we create. But also, when we find great resources, we link that back to our page. Like, for example, Health Action International has created amazing snakebite prevention guides that I think, would be just absolutely useful. So they've created some for Uganda and Kenya, and they're working on many more. And as we start to see more projects that are focusing on snakebite, and especially because there's so much more funding available now with the being declared a neglected tropical disease, we're going to see some really incredible educational materials that are produced, not just by Save the Snakes, but by others. And so we would love to create like a resource portal for that. So we're working on it.
Well, it's stuff like that as you can say, you probably could, if people want to get involved, especially as you say, translate people who do speak different languages. If they want to get involved in these causes, is people like that we really, really needed to help. And as you say, so if people want to get involved in your organisation or some of the work that you're doing, how can they actually do that?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways. And so some of the best ways that we really need help, I'll think about some specific ways. So one, translators are really helpful. But simply, might sound really kind of like, oh, this isn't going to help, but spreading the word. When people share some of like Save the Snakes content on their Facebook pages, or they on Twitter or Instagram or whatever, or they just link a website, just getting the word out there is so incredibly impactful, because it starts conversations. And so when someone shares something on their social media page, and then their community, looks at it and they're like, snakes, why are we going to save snakes? This is ridiculous. And that person that is passionate about snakes starts actually a discussion about, why they're important. it actually really does make quite an impact. It changes the way that people think about these animals. And so that helps us with our mission, which I know that's incredibly vague and like it may not seem like it's very helpful, but just talking about snakes and snake conservation and why they're important, it actually does help quite a bit. Some other ways, we have some specific tasks that we need help with. So, for example, graphic designers, we're always in need of people to help us make some dynamic content that gets sent from around the world. Something we haven't published yet, but we finished a venomous snakes of West Africa guide, which was actually sent to a community in Sierra Leone. It was actually a farming community where they were having a problem with snakes, and so they were just looking for anything that was specific to their area. And so we're trying to do more and more of that kind of work. And so we worked with an incredible graphic designer to create the guide that we then, back in the United States, we laminated it and shipped a box full of these guides and actually snake gaiters, so protective footwear so that people can avoid snake bite. And then in the United States, we're actually especially in California, we're looking for snake educators, so people that can actually help us with on the ground events, because we're based in Sacramento, California. And we actually do quite a few events every year where we just, go to farmers markets or go to nature festivals and talk to people about snakes. But I didn't speak too much about what else we're working on in the United States, but we're also looking at resolving rattlesnake conflicts. For example, we're beginning to conduct property inspections, and we actually just led our first rattlesnake handling workshop. So getting people to learn how to handle snakes in case they might find one on their property. Some people just don't have the time or resources to call, a snake rescuer. They need to learn how to do it themselves. And so we teach people, safe and professional ways to move a rattlesnake or any snake that might be found on their property. And so we're looking for people that are based in Northern California that can actually help us with that work. And then lastly, just like any nonprofit organization, a little donation goes such a long way. And so we're able to support these programs internationally because, compassionate people that love snakes donate to our work. And I would love to work with companies or other organizations to see how we can actually grow the impact of some of these programs. And, like I said, $1,000 can really jumpstart a project in some part of the world. And we get proposals all the time for incredibly important projects, but we can only fund a few. So the more people that want to contribute to the work of Save the Snakes, that allows us to keep up with this work. And so I have to give a shout out to all the amazing people that, do donate or volunteer their time to save the snakes. I'm sure some of your listeners has contributed to our cause, and for that, we're eternally grateful.
Yeah, and I think, and it's great that people are able to get involved. And as you say, it's something as simple as sharing Facebook content. I'll spit my words out in a second. Sharing the Facebook content and the Instagram content and any social media that makes a big difference. And that's something that I think we're seeing in general across the whole lot. As you say, it's getting people the education to help with the snake-human conflict rather than actually it is one of the biggest challenges, and it's making the biggest difference.
Exactly.
I say people like yourselves and your organisation and the work that you're supporting, and that makes a big difference. As you say, it's making a big difference to snake conservation, and it's also making a big difference to the conflict as well between humans and snakes, and helping towards the snake bite issue. It's pretty incredible work that you're involved in and that's going on. So, as you say, you still keep a few species yourself. Is there what species do you still currently keep?
So actually, I have not had a pet snake in years, just because I was traveling too much or working too much. But we recognize that at some of our events in California, people want to see a snake. They want to see a live snake. And I'm sure if you've done any education work, you know this as well. And the moment when someone, gets a snake in their hand and they're able to see it's not this terrifying animal, it changes hearts and minds. And so we actually found some people volunteered to donate their animals because they could no longer keep them. And so we keep 2 or 3 native species, 2 species, 3 individuals. We have 2 Pacific gopher snakes, in Pituophis, and then we have a Lampropeltis, a California king snake, which is sort of our ambassador animals. And so they help us, to help educate people about these animals and also learn about some of our non-venomous species we have in California. In Northern California, we only have 1 venomous snake, medically significant, right? I know you have a lot of rear fang snake people. But yeah, we only have the rattlesnake, which is a potential threat for people. And people are always looking to identify them or learn more about them. And so they don't, maybe kill a non-venomous snake like a gopher snake, which can actually look like a rattlesnake sometimes. And so these snakes they're great for our programs, and hopefully they're not getting too tired because they work for their mice. I'll put it that way.
And I think with certain North American colubrids as well, they mimic rattlesnakes very well. They shake their tails in the hope that they will be hitting some dry leaves to make the rattle noise, don't they, and stuff. So it makes it easier for people to misidentify them when they're doing that, because they think, oh, I can hear a rattle, it must be a rattlesnake.
Exactly.
And that again drives in some conflict between snakes and humans, because they think that it isn't what it is. I think from being from North California, you're quite restricted to venomous snake species, but I think people think of California and they think more of the southern state part of the state and the abundance around there, New Mexico, Arizona, and the species that they have all down there, and they don't realise actually that California is quite a big place and the species are quite diverse across it.
I know. So, yeah, it takes to get to some of those southern, species. It takes me like 6 hours to get there by car. So
at the same time as it takes us to traverse the whole length of our country. I think people don't in the Western world, especially in Western Europe. Well, in Europe especially, we don't see distance the same way as Americans do. Definitely.
Yeah, we have a lot of friends in Europe and the UK, and we joke about that a lot.
We moan about an hour drive, but within an hour drive, we're pretty much halfway across the country from east to west. So it's considerably different for us. But as I say, it's different for us regarding reptiles as well. Obviously, we are very kind of restricted to populations here. Everything is within a specific area and habitat within the UK, so which is dwindling in size. So is Save the Snakes getting involved in any projects within Europe, or is there any scope to do so?
So we made somewhat of a conscious effort to short answer is no. And the reason for that is because we understand, at least in our current capacity, that because we're not a large organization with a large budget as well. And so we know that we can support smaller projects internationally that'll have a greater impact. And we also see that there's a little bit of a greater need for some of these species internationally. And so that's what we focus on. But we definitely recognize that in Europe, in the UK, some of your snake species they need some help. Luckily, we have some great people in our advisory committee that are actually based in Europe and in the UK as well, that they have kind of been helping us with just learning more about some of the issues that they face. Just an example, we have an advisory committee member, Stephen Elaine, who's doing some research on grass snakes. And he's really learning more about these species, and he constantly shares updates that we share with our supporters. And we have an article that's going to go up on our website in a few days, all about his work to study grass snakes and his work in the UK. So that's sort of one way that we try and highlight the issues that snakes in Europe and the UK face. by just talking to researchers and talking to people that are working with them to highlight the work that they're doing. Even if we don't support them monetarily, we can support them by broadcasting their efforts, and hopefully they get people that are interested in supporting their work.
And as you say, kind of we do have species in Europe that we are losing populations of, and we're losing numbers, and it does feel like sometimes that Europe gets pretty much forgotten when it comes to snakebite and reptile conservation, except for certain species which are heavily protected in the south of France, Malplon obviously being one of them, and such forth.
Right.
That we're not doing. It doesn't feel like we're doing that much work around it all in Europe, and at the minute, which that may change, and I think it will change. More people see the issues and understand the issues, and as you say, a lot of it is visibility and education, and getting that education is the hard. Getting people that education is the hardest thing really. So
Yes.
I am very conscious of time, and we have recorded for around about an hour already, which that has genuinely flown by, absolutely flown by. And normally we have to have a lot more input, but you've been absolutely incredible, genuinely
thank you.
been really incredible, and I don't think we've not had to steer you, we've not had to keep the conversation flowing. You've pretty much presented yourself, so I might call this episode the Save the Snakebite episode rather than the name we were thinking. But yeah, so thank you very much for joining us today. It's been great, and it's been so refreshing to talk about with somebody so passionate about a different side of snakes and the whole situation, and like to see how the conservation efforts and the education that you're giving to people to help with those efforts is making a difference on our main subjects, obviously snakebite, and how they are coupled quite closely together, and that's absolutely amazing to hear. And I think that will definitely be a lot of food for thought for our listeners there, and how they can maybe change certain things or do certain things that can help out with your own organisation or with other efforts that are going on around the world, with either in conservation or snakebite, or primarily just sharing information whenever they see it or whenever it's available on their own Facebook walls, to get that information as widespread as possible. Because you don't know if one person shares it and then they have another person share it, all of a sudden it's got a completely new audience, and that education, that helps educate a lot more people. So
of course
it's really interesting that you've everything you've said has backed up all our ideas and everything everybody's been saying to us in every single episode. So it's great to see that full circle back, that even in conservation, the issues you have with conservation are very similar to the issues that the people working on snakebite are having, and those issues seem to be primarily around the education side. So that's been great. So I'd just like to again thank you so much, Michael, for coming on the show today, and I'd also like to thank our listeners for listening as per usual. And please remember to like our Facebook page, Instagram, and please do share our content around. With all of this, we'll be putting some more content up in the next couple of weeks on Save the Snakes and on the work that they're doing, and also some of the work that other people are doing, bite reports and everything else. And please do share all this information about. It benefits everybody who reads it, and it's helping spread that education and fully understand exactly how we can try and mitigate this human-snake conflict that's currently going on, and also help with the conservation of snakes as well. So thank you everybody for listening, and good night.